what I'll do in the next 40 minutes, and I'll try to stick to that time, to really go through the various themes that I've written in my book about. And it's a wide range of themes. I've spent 40 years to study this. And despite the potential concern that some people had that this is way too many different aspects of brain-gut interactions, hopefully at the end you'll see this is in some ways all connected and makes the brain-gut and now brain-gut microbiome connection really a vital part of our health and well-being. So I talk about this in my book. So my first gut-based decision was not to stay in the family tradition of making fancy candies and chocolates. I've probably indulged on high sugar diets for a long enough time and have completely withdrawn from that. But at about the same time, the model that medicine had of the human body and health and disease was really the sort of the steam engine type metaphor. Just as humans, we always use our technical accomplishments at a given time to model how we understand our body and biology. So this was a very mechanical construct where different parts did very specific individual sections. If something broke down, you would treat that specific part, or with surgery, you would take it out and now replace it. And this model still persists in, I would say, in medical school to a large degree. It also persists in many physicians that are now in practice. It's gradually breaking down because of several reasons. I'm just going to mention a few of those. So one is sort of the discovery, the exponential discovery of and generation of knowledge about our brains. That has moved rapidly away from the old-fashioned way that there's certain regions in the brain that do individual things, and if you have a tumor in one, then only one thing changes. So now the concept is the brain connectome. Every part of the brain is interconnected with each other, and there's a large effort to sort of dissect this. So the brain connectome is clearly one of the things that is driving our reassessment of how we understand the biology of our body. And one thing that has, to a large degree, has driven all this development, that we no longer have to rely on simplistic concepts and models, is the exponential growth of computers and supercomputers, the generation of massive amounts of data from every aspect of from our body and our brain, and the capacity of these computers to put this all together with machine learning approaches and detect patterns in it that we didn't really hypothesize before based on our limited understanding. So many of the experiments that have been done, still being done, are very linear ideas that if you isolate point A and look at point B, then if you do something to point A, something changes at point B. That's not how the organism works, and that's not how the supercomputers work. So we have come up with an understanding of so one system that has particularly lent itself to this new concept is how the brain and the gut and the microbes, the 100 trillion microbes that live in the gut, and they live in other places as well of our body, but in the large intestine, the highest density and largest number. So this is all of a sudden driving sort of an explosion of interest in these complex interactions that play a role in health and disease. So this is not just pretty pictures, but it's also, we understand now that not only is the brain organized in these multiple interacting networks, but also the gastrointestinal tract. And if you see on the left lower portion of the slide, there's been tremendous breakthroughs and discovery of all these individual cells that are shown here, that are basically all in the gut wall. So this very thin thing that surrounds your gut contains all these different cell types, from the largest part of the body's immune system the largest part of the nervous system outside of the brain. 100 million neurons sandwiched in between the layers of your gut, and many other cell types. And in addition, on top of it, you see the actual lumen of the gut with the microbes that have really drawn the attention now of people on the system. And what's unique about this is that every single cell that's outlined here that has pretty much been studied in isolation is communicating with each other. So this is clearly another connectome where it's just beginning now. People have characterized individual cells, but we're just beginning now to identify how these cells work in combination in a network. And it's, so you have 100 trillion microbes that are non-human that communicate with this very complex human system in very intricate connections. So, I mean, I've been interested in looking at the brain-gut axis for most of my career. For about 30 years, this hasn't really generated much interest outside of a small group of so-called neurogastroenterologists who are interested in what used to be called psychosomatic disorders like irritable bowel syndrome or functional gastrointestinal disorders. The last 10 years has seen an explosion of interest. Now all of a sudden everybody is a self-declared brain gut microbiome expert. There's multiple books out there, and every part of medicine and science has now incorporated this system as a fundamental, potentially fundamental influence on anything from psychiatric disease to metabolic disease. And it's also kind of amazing that in our traditional view of medicine, of health and disease, the microbiome did not really play any role in it. So even though if you put because we obviously can't see it, we couldn't culture it, still can't culture the majority of these organisms. So only with these modern sequencing techniques and the affordability, because it became so inexpensive to do that, was it possible to detect this system. And some people have referred to it as a forgotten organ. So all our models of disease and health really been made without taking this into account. It's kind of remarkable that some things really work in medicine by leaving one organ out. On the other hand, in many diseases, we have really failed to develop new and effective therapies, such as depression, many of the brain disorders, but also irritable bowel syndrome, which is still sort of more art than science, the way it's being treated and understood. And you can see from the comparison, it would be a fairly large organ. I mean, larger than the brain, kind of comparable to the liver. What's even more amazing is, so not just the numbers that how many organisms are there, but actually what their capabilities are. And this is kind of most puzzling, really, that in comparison to our 20,000 genes, there's some 9 million genes that these microbes contribute. So 360 to 500 bacterial genes for every human gene. People have always wondered why 20,000 genes would be enough to create the complexity of our organism. But we have sort of this vast reservoir of additional genes that that the microbes can use to produce things, new things that have not happened in evolution. Possibly one of the reasons why they can adapt to these dramatic changes that have occurred in modern diets and all the medications we put in ourselves. So the fact that we can deal with this has a lot to do with the ability of these, nearly unlimited ability of these microbes to deal with it. So what do they do most of the time? So without getting into the details, on top of it, you see that they're able to break down, it's listed here for starch, but any of the carbohydrates, the undigestible carbohydrates that we eat with plant-based foods that our human small intestine can't break down and digest and assimilate, the microbes can break this down into smaller units like these short-chain fatty acids, also proteins into amines and phenols, And that's clearly probably one of the most important functions why we have them, because it allows us to break down things, and our ancestors who didn't have fire to cook things, so raw vegetables were even more dependent on, and plants, on this digestion by the microbes. They also do other things. So for example, they break down molecules like these lignans into estrogen-like molecules. They can break down the xenobiotics, which is really drugs and toxins, all the things that evolution has not made us to deal with effectively based on our own human processes. They can use their vast repertoire of genes to break down many of these molecules and to detoxify them. And so the last sort of overview of this is the molecules that come as sort of the leftovers from this process of breaking down things that we ingest that can't be absorbed in the small intestine. The leftover is also not wasted. So some of these molecules, like the short-chain fatty acid, can be absorbed in the large intestine, and so it's a harvesting of calories that normally would be lost. So just think about our ancestors who didn't have all the highly processed foods. In order to survive, they had to have an ability, because they were dependent mainly on plants and plant-based foods. They were able to salvage energy that they then could absorb after the microbes had broken it down. But they do a lot more things. So for example, some of these molecules that they produce during this fermentation process can reach the immune system, the brain, the stress system, the cardiovascular system, also the nerves within the GI tract, the gut. So virtually it's a factory that influences most of our body functions. Probably not just in the adult, but also during development. On the right side here, you see a list of substances that are particularly interesting for the communication with the nervous system. So there's so-called neuroactive substances, often precursors of our own or analogs of our own neurotransmitters. And I'll tell you in a minute how it came to that. So how the microbes can produce substances that are so similar to the molecules that our brain uses and our enteric nervous system uses to communicate. So in the last 10 years only, so this has been a really young field, people have come up with experiments in mice, and I won't go into the caveats that clearly a mouse is not a human, and you have to be very careful to extrapolate from these spectacular findings in mice. But they have to open up this idea that the microbes are able to affect our behavior and our brain and our mind. So one example is that, so there's a technique called the fecal microbial transplant, where you take fecal materials from a mouse, put it into a mouse that has grown up without the bacteria, so-called germ-free or notobiotic mouse, and then you look at the behavior of that mouse after the transplant. And so one interesting example that started the whole theory of psychobiotics, or the ability of these microbes to affect psychological and psychiatric phenomena. So they took stool samples from a mouse that genetically is a more timid or introvert animal based on its behavior. Obviously, we can't talk to these mice. Put it into a germ-free mouse that had a genetic background to be the opposite in terms of its behavior and engagement with the environment. And just from their fecal transplant, this animal became the same behavioral phenotype as the donor mouse. So nothing else was changed. So that almost, the only way to explain this is that there's something in this transplanted fecal material that made it to the brain and changed the behavior of this mouse. And then equally intriguing, this was done with a genetically modified mouse, the so-called TR5 knockout, that it has an obese phenotype and overeats if food is available. So when the microbes, the fecal samples from these obese animals were given to lean, germ-free animals, they turned into the same phenotype, that they not only became obese, but they also had completely changed their ingestive behavior. They were, as long as there was food in the cage, they would not stop eating. So again, something in the fecal material, something that the microbes produce, completely changed the behavior of this mouse in a pretty vital function. So I'm not going to go through all these animal experiments. There's been criticism about this, how they were done, if these germ-free mice are really, I mean, they're not normal, if that's really the way that we can mimic something that has human relevance. But these experiments have led to many investigations, now ongoing investigations in human populations. So why are the gut microbes able to talk to our brains? Is that something that they've learned from us, or is it something that the microbes have, at some point during evolution have contributed to our to the development of our nervous system? So briefly go through several billion years of evolution. In the oceans of the world, for more than 3 billion years, the only inhabitants were these microorganisms, the marine animals, and the marine microbes. And so they had a lot of time to develop communication systems with each other. So it's an unimaginable time span, really. And think about these millions of genes that each of these microorganisms has. They developed this knowledge, this wisdom from that time that they lived in the ocean without any animals. Then about 500 million years ago, some of the first, most primitive marine animals, like the hydra, and essentially they appeared. And essentially what the hydra is a digestive tube with a nerve net around it. So a floating tube that's surrounded by a nerve net. You can see this here. And the microbes in the form of algae, the first microbes, were then made the decision in evolutionary terms to live inside that floating tube. It gave them the free transport, protection from other factors. And from that time on, this principle in evolution has stayed the same. For every animal, and insect and fish, this principle to have microbes living inside of you, inside your gut, has been maintained. So it must be very valuable and adaptive. So if a trait like this is preserved over hundreds of millions of years, it must be quite important. Now, just to show you why it's so plausible that the gut microbes and the gut itself play such an important role in our brain health, in our brain-gut axis. So this is an image from these marine animals, the hydra, and what you can see is basically the equivalent of a peristaltic reflex, exactly the same mechanism that moves our food through our small intestine. On top of it, you see these nerve nets around it, and if I show you now what has been found in the enteric nervous system of the human gut, it's almost indistinguishable from that image. So the same principle has sort of been conserved really over 500 million years, that a nerve net surrounding our GI tract is able to generate the basic patterns of peristalsis. So, and only very recently then, there has been once animals become polar, to have a head and a tail, a central nervous system developed. And ultimately, this evolution came to the highest form of development in the human brain. But many of the transmitters and the signaling molecules that had come from the microbes in these marine animals then were transferred, their genetic material, to the enteric nervous system, also made it to the brain. So evolutionists has sort of really liked this idea to use the same molecules have existed for billions of years to use in a very complex computer system in our brain that we have today. So after this kind of introductory whirlwind tour through evolution and giving the rationale for why it's important that why the gut microbes in the gut have such a prominent role in affecting our emotions and our behavior, just a couple examples how that manifests in humans. So I like to see this in a very simplistic way, that there's gut reactions that come from the brain and go to the gut, and there's gut sensations that go from the gut to the brain. I'll show you that this is a lot more complicated, but you can almost look at it as the yin and yang of the brain-gut interactions. And what's also important is that is a completely integrated unit. It's not that you can say, well, in this individual, it's only the gut reaction, and this it's the gut sensations. When you engage this system, it always acts in synchrony as a circular generator of both emotional brain functions and also gut functions. So if you start with the gut reactions, there's a lot of pathways, many through the autonomic nervous system that go down to the gut. They can influence contractions of the gut, blood flow, secretion of mucus, of water. And now we also know that they can directly influence the microbes. So, for example, the neurotransmitter norepinephrine that gets elevated when you're stressed, makes your heart beat faster. The microbes have receptors and react to this neurotransmitter. So when you're stressed, you change the microbial behavior. So any emotional feeling like fear, anxiety, anger, possibly happiness, and possibly social connectedness, we don't know the equivalent of these positive emotions, because in science you generally study something that has gone wrong or is a disease mechanism. So we know very little about how positive emotions, what kind of signals they send down to the gut. But just like the facial expression that everybody recognizes, and they're basically mediated by nerve output from the brain to the facial muscles. So you could recognize any of these faces instantaneously. Keep in mind that the same thing happens at the gut level. So every emotion has a mirror image to the facial expression at the gut level that correspond to this emotion. So the arrows show decreased contractions, the upward pointing arrows increased contractions. Have been shown to be associated with these different emotional states. I mean, this has a lot of implications. So when I made this slide many years ago, this was still without the microbes. We did not. Now you have to imagine that these emotions are also associated with particular states of microbial behavior and different products that they produce. So if you eat a meal, if this individual eats a meal here, or when he's happy, the way it's processed in your gut and by the microbes is quite different depending on the emotional state. So I would generally advise not to eat something when you're in any of those negative emotions, and defer to a time where you feel better. So the other thing is equally intriguing. The majority of information goes really from the gut to the brain. And still not 100% known today why there is this imbalance between what goes down and what comes up. But it's quite well characterized what parts of the brain this information gets to. There's a structure called the insular cortex, and it goes in the back part of this brain region. And then in the front part, when it makes its way to the front part, it's modulated by all these other factors: attention, affect, stress, and memory. So the information that comes from the gut is modulated, so like an editor of a movie, in the front part, and that ultimately results in a conscious gut feeling. So gut sensation is anything that comes up. Gut feeling is when you actually experience it as an emotion. So I recently had the opportunity to see something that looked like a perfect analogy to this process. So this was at the Biennale in Venice, and of modern art. So this is one display. Each of those little images is a video playing where the person tells their personal story. This looks even more impressive when you look at the entire display. So there's literally thousands of human stories being told by these individuals. You can't, when you look at it from below, you can't really see what's going on. And that's a very similar process of what we think is happening with all information, that in every given emotional moment, your gut reacts and the information is being sent up to the brain from the day you're born. And you develop this what Antonio Damasio has called these somatic markers, or I like to call it emotional video clips that we encode in our brain. And if you say that somebody makes a decision based on their gut feelings, it's not necessary that you use that slow process. It's a very fast decision making, like it's intuitive. So it's not necessary that your brain goes down to the gut and see how the gut feels and then gets this information. It most likely accesses this vast database that's been stored in your brain, your most personal, individual body of information that we all carry around with us in our memories. And just like a Google search engine or the Amazon search engines does a nonlinear computation of what's the most appropriate decision based on all these other tens of thousands of experiences that you've had. So let's switch gears. So this is sort of the second part of the book, which surprisingly to me has actually generated more interest than the first part. So in my career, I found this the most fascinating, that how the gut is so intricately connected to our emotions and our ability to make decisions. But the second part about food and microbes and the brain has sort of really become a major topic for the lay media, and there's almost nothing you can read today about diet and food without taking this, without reading about the role of the microbes. And in a very simple way to understand this and how unique it is, so below now you see the lumen, the inside of the gut, on the upper part of this layer of cells, of gut cells. You see some of the other players that I've shown you earlier, this gut connectome. And I just want to highlight it for a couple of examples how amazing this actually is and how it links us with our brain function to what we feed our microbes and what we ingest. So after hearing this, you probably will become more mindful when you eat something, all the things that are happening. You're not just absorbing carbohydrates where you have to be worried about gaining weight or absorb your vitamins. There's a lot more going on in terms of this information processing. And you could almost say food is you can conceptualize food as a carrier of information that you get every time you eat a meal. So what you can see here, there's different cells that have been oversimplified clearly, that have been identified as playing a particularly important role. And I'll just mention the first two. So the blue one is a so-called enterochromaffin cells, contains 95% or more of the body's serotonin. So it's not in the brain. So if you, I'm sure somebody here is on a serotonin reuptake inhibitor, medication for depression. Psychiatrists have developed all these medications and prescribed these medications without ever thinking that the majority of this molecule is actually in the gut. And you can see there's little sort of extensions sticking out into the gut lumen. These are called microbiome that sample everything that goes on inside the gut and moves by. So we know that mechanical forces can activate these cells, but now we also know they have multiple receptors for molecules that the microbes produce. And then the second cell, the purple cell, is an immune cell, so-called dendritic cell. There's multiple different cell types, but this one is intriguing because it has this tentacle that sticks into the lumen of the gut, has receptors, and again, many of the molecules that the microbes produce are located on these extensions. So whatever goes on inside the gut and is changed when you eat something, the microbes produce all these metabolites and breakdown products. They act on these cells. Some of them actually, if you have a leaky gut, some of these molecules can go directly through the gut wall, this barrier, and influence, for example, the immune cells or other cell types that are present. And then what I already mentioned on the far right, you see this pathway where the brain sends down signals to these nerves in the gut to release the neurotransmitters that we use for, like during a fight and flight response or during stress. And these molecules change the behavior of all the microbes in the gut. So if you eat while you're stressed, it will be a totally different scenario here than if you're relaxed and you don't have these stress mediators influencing your gut microbes. So let me say a few words about this cell that's shown here in blue, because that illustrates this even more strikingly. Now you see it in green. We know just in the last 2 years, and I want to emphasize, many of these things are happening in the last 10 years. This is a rapidly evolving area. So you see this enterochromaffin cell, the serotonin-containing cell, and on the inside of the lumen, the gut with the microbes communicating with it. We now know that 60% of the production of the serotonin is influenced by the microbes, by signaling molecules that they produce. So that idea is actually amazing, that a molecule that's so essential for our well-being, our mood, our pain sensitivity, our sleep, would be controlled to 60% by the microbes. And also an insight that we've gained recently is that nerves can make these synaptic, very close contacts with these cells. So when this cell is activated, for example, by a microbial signal, a direct signal goes into our, what's called the limbic system, or the emotional part of the brain, and has an influence on that. If you put food on top of this, which can influence these cells, so for example, food that is high in serotonin, like chocolate, for example, or oysters, will activate these cells to produce these serotonin-stimulating cells in these enterochromaffin cells. So obviously for psychiatry, this is a totally new frontier of discovery, and it's just one cell. So we used to think until a couple of years ago that there's only 20 different cell types with different hormones. Some play a role in satiety and in other functions. There's probably hundreds of these different cell types, and all of them respond differently to different signaling molecules from the microbes. Let me also say a couple of things about these immune cells, because it's a particularly relevant mechanism in terms of what food does to our health. So I mentioned these dendritic cells. So depending on what food we eat, if you eat a food that, for example, that's high in animal fats, it will change the microbial populations in a way that a substance is produced called LPS, so lipopolysaccharide, kind of an inflammatory molecule that can activate these cells, can make the gut leakier, and basically lead to what's been called a metabolic toxemia, or low-grade inflammation throughout your body that can affect virtually every organ. It's been implicated in cardiovascular disease as a major risk factor, also in the degenerative brain diseases like Alzheimer's disease, possibly Parkinson's disease, and also in appetite control. In this chronic inflammation messes up our regulator in the brain that shuts off, or that creates satiety, shuts off our appetite. So this is what happens. So this is the normal interaction of the microbes with the gut lumen. This in yellow is a mucus layer that separates us from the microbes. And normally this system is in balance. So what happens with a high-fat diet? There's this increase of these bacteria that have in their membrane this inflammatory molecule. And this what's called LPS translocation. This molecule transfers the gut wall, gets into the systemic circulation, and has been identified as playing a major role in many metabolic diseases, and has been hypothesized to play a role in neurological diseases as well. So the last part, I think I'm almost done with my time. I'll try to cut this short, even though it's sort of has some very nice images in it. This is this idea that the gut plays a big role in our health has long been known in traditional healing systems, traditional Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine, Hippocratic medicine. I think we're just on the verge now of rediscovering this concept that the gut is not just there for digestion, but also for overall health. There's a tremendous number of books out there. I don't necessarily recommend that you, unless you have already read them, to read them now, because it's been amazing that every few years new trends come up that are not really based on science, but authors pick particular things that are particularly intriguing, like the leakiness of the gut, and then base the whole story around them. So the explosion of gluten sensitivity after the Grain Brain book came out, and the popularity now of eating high-fat diets, and also this sort of paradox that the best thing for us is a clean gut, which means you clean all these complex ecosystems of bacteria out of your gut. So none of this really makes much sense. In my own experience, so long before I was interested really, so this was during college in these connections. So I had the opportunity to participate in a film expedition to these Amerindians on the Orinoco River in the border between Venezuela and Brazil. And so we lived with these people and filmed them for about 2 months. And, I did a journal and wrote down all the things that they ate. Later went back and sort of people have tried to study this to find out. So essentially what they eat is mainly a plant-based diet with a small amount of animal products. So they're essentially the remnants of hunter-gatherers that have lived on the earth for a very long time. There's other populations, small populations in Africa, the Hasda. And so is there a lesson that we can learn from these individuals? So microbiome research, kind of amazing to me that some 40 years after I lived there and was involved in making a movie about them, scientists went there and studied the gut microbiome of these people. And in terms of the native people on the Orinoco River, so just from a very seminal study, it was concluded based on the findings that the microbiome of these uncontacted people exhibited the highest diversity ever reported in any human group. So they had the most intact ecosystem inside. And if you look at what their diet is, it's 70-80% plant-based. So there's a lot of other factors, the exercise, the long nursing of their infants. But I think a very important thing for me was to see that there must be some connection between what they eat as a regular diet and what their microbes are. And it makes a lot of sense because the microbes, their main function is to break down these undigestible food components. So if you put a lot of these undigested food components into the gut, clearly from day one, when you're born, it's pretty clear that this would nurture these microbes and increase their diversity. There's still a big question mark: is diversity, the maximum diversity of our gut microbiome, how important is this for our health? We only have 40% of the diversity of these hunter-gatherers. Many people believe that many of our current diseases that have increased, like autoimmune diseases, asthma, allergies, inflammatory bowel disease, possibly autism, are really related to this degradation of that ecosystem that these people still have in their intact way. So by looking around in the literature, and I'm not a dietary expert, I'm a gastroenterologist that typically does not get trained in anything that has to do with nutrition, surprisingly. So what I found, there's diets around the world that are actually similar, that not specifically to the things, but to that these people eat in the jungle or in the desert in Africa, but that are similar in the composition between plant-based foods and animal-based foods. So this 70 to 30% to 80 to 20% ratio. So one is clearly, if you go to Italy, particularly if you go back to the, there's an extensive literature on the Mediterranean diet. You see there's this enormous variety of plant-based products and also a lot of fish, and the composition of the Mediterranean diet has sort of been summarized and has become the basis really of a lot of dietary recommendations. And it's intriguing that it's a similar kind of composition of the overall, the origin of these foods as these hunter-gatherers had. Another important thing is that the small amount of animal products that have a high fat, saturated fat content, like red meat, it's actually was a very small portion. Now this has changed over the years. So the first studies were in the 60s. In Italy, this has clearly changed, both in the overall volume of the meal, but also in the change in this ratio of animal products or animal meats and fats to the other components. Important on the lower, this was emphasized in all the studies that have been done about the health benefits, that there's also lifestyle factors, particularly the social activities around meals that's characteristic of these Mediterranean countries. It seems that if you eat that diet from studies in a different context where you've lost the ability to do these rituals, to eating within a community, either the family or with friends, the benefits, the health benefits go down. And there have been many, so I wanted the time to go through this. Some of the best studies in dietary assessments have been done with the Mediterranean diet. Some of these studies had to be stopped before they ended because the benefit in the treatment group that were on the Mediterranean diet was so much higher than the people that did not take it. And there's many reasons why that's the case. I've just listed a couple here. So as I tried to explain to you throughout this presentation, this high ratio of the plant-based to animal-based food components, this high ratio of plant-based monounsaturated fats to the saturated fats from animal fats, and most likely this anti-inflammatory effect that these diets have, based on some of the things I explained to you from how the microbes interact with our immune system in the gut. It's not limited to the Mediterranean diet. So I personally spend more time. It's easier to explore the Mediterranean diet than some of these others. But in a recent interesting article in the Huffington Post, so they provided, this author provided evidence that the first four of these are kind of similar in their general composition. And have been shown to have health benefits. The French diet was called a paradox because obviously the French love to eat animal-based fats and meat. And it's not known, is this for genetic reasons? Is it because the quantities that the French eat typically are much lower than the quantities that other cultures eat? And so we don't know this. It's certainly not that there's only one diet that would be health promoting. One diet that I've recently experienced personally on a trip to Korea is the Korean diet. So fermented foods and probiotics are clearly a very hot thing these days. It used to be absent from the North American diet as opposed to almost every culture in the world. I think the Koreans probably have the record in the variety of these fermented foods. So this was a typical dish in a typical Korean restaurant with a main dish shown in the middle, and this automatically comes with these 30 side dishes of all kinds of different fermented foods. So what we know is that each of those vegetables creates its own probiotic strain. So you can imagine if you eat this diet 3 times a day, which many people do, you get a mega dose of probiotics, and that starts in infancy. So I don't know if there's any Korean Americans in the audience, but I've confirmed this in discussions with a lot of my Korean collaborators. This has changed over time. We don't know if this really confers such a dramatic health benefit as you would expect from the advertisements today. If you go on the internet and look at different books, that taking one probiotic is going to takes care of all the health problems. So it's certainly not that easy. So I want to stop with this last concept, a couple of slides, about what we're learning. So not just about the microbes per se and the health benefits, but in order to understand the microbes, there's this vast number of these microbes and how they interact with each other and with us. It's sort of introduced this ecological view, in my opinion, sometimes called the systems biology view, that we really look at the connectedness of things and how important they are for our health and well-being. And to just give an example, so ecosystems on Earth, 7 billion humans, 9 million species, and the balance, the interaction of multiple ecosystems ultimately determine the ecosystem, Earth. We know that if you look at the Earth, a lot of things are obviously, with climate change being the most important one, have been changing dramatically, but it's really the sum of the degradation in many of these ecosystems around us. So, and I could give many examples that are directly relevant to human health. On a microbial level, so this is something that we haven't seen before. Everybody has seen the beauty of nature and the systems. We haven't really seen this until about 7 to 10 years ago. But we know now that these microbes live in all different compartments in our body, not just inside. And I think it's time to look at the human body as an ecosystem similar to Earth, and look at health really as the establishment or re-establishment of the diversity and the balance within that system. Is this gonna transform medicine? I'll show you a few answers to this question that people in the past have given to developments and how wrong they were. So my personal answer to that is yes, it definitely will happen. It happens on all levels in science, not so much in mainstream medicine. But here's some of the answers or the comments that people made. So particularly relevant is the one on the right lower corner. Biological processes are organized into simple pathways. So this was still the dogma for many scientists have not jumped on this bandwagon of looking at the things differently. But this is the new view, that the systems view, or the looking at a lot of phenomena around us, because we can collect all these data. So it's shown for security, air traffic, weather. So most functions, we necessarily don't think about this at the same insights that we get how these complex systems operate. We're now applying to understand human health and human disease. So no longer that simple linear model. So I mean, I could speak a lot of time about this, but just remember the progress we have made in predicting the weather from 20 years ago, where it was nearly impossible. That's a good example of, I think, what will happen in medicine as well. So sorry for going over time. hopefully there will be a little bit of time left for questions. So many of the things you want to read this in detail, you can go to my book and do that. Thank you very much for your attention.
How do the microbes in our gut deal with maybe more non-traditional food, such as all the processed food diets have nowadays?
There's now a series of studies that have come out. For example, emulsifiers that are an important component of most processed foods, how they can affect the microbes and how they can contribute to the leakiness of the gut and this whole consequence of that. The same thing with some artificial sweeteners. Not every single one has been tested, but 3 different ones have been tested, and they have the same negative effect on the ecology of the gut microbiome. So I think what we're facing today is something that evolution has not anticipated. Really an unexpected onslaught on a massive level with antibiotics, antibiotic-tainted food. Almost all the meat products contain small doses of antibiotics that have been shown to affect the microbiome. The chronic stress, which we know now affects the microbes, and the processed foods. So it's not just one thing. I think what we're seeing today, that some of these diseases have increased exponentially in the last 40 years, while infectious diseases have gone down. It's probably a combination, different patterns of combinations of all these new influences. But processed food almost certainly plays a major role. The good news is that many companies have realized that there's a tremendous counter movement now. People are no longer are much more aware of this, and are trying actively to change that. Some more honestly than others. But so I've consulted with some companies in the food industry. It's actually impressive what they're trying to do. But they always say if they don't do it, then people go and buy the sweet stuff from another company. So it's necessary to have an educational process that people stop automatically, buying the unhealthy stuff and realize, it may taste better, but it's also bad for my health.
I learned somewhere, and this may be incorrect, so I'd like to know, that there are genes in microbes that are not present in humans that are necessary for normal human development in the gut cells. Is that correct, that these genes are not endogenous to the human genome but are necessary for development?
Well, I mean, we can only conclude from these germ-free or notobiotic animals that so almost every animal can grow up in a germ-free condition, not just mice or rats, or I think even horses and monkeys have been shown, but they have every system in the body and in the brain is altered in these animals. So it's not things that are essential for life, but essential for an optimal functioning. And again, I think the main influence is early in life, is during this development. I think as an adult, just look at this, that our diversity and abundance of microbes has gone down, by 50, 60% compared to the hunter-gatherers. We're still, overall pretty healthy. So it's not resulted in dramatic. And what we're seeing now is in the last 40 years is something different. It's something, that all of a sudden we see all these new diseases coming up. But I think, so it's not they're not essential for life, but they're clearly essential for an optimal functioning of our bodies.
And they are separate genes?
Yeah.
They are bacterial genes?
Yeah, they're bacterial genes, and there's a process, it's called this lateral gene transfer, where microorganisms can transfer their genes onto mammalian cells. That certainly has happened during evolution. If that still goes on today, we don't know. Another aspect is, so these microbes in early development, they can go in the crypts in our gut lining where the stem cells are, and can change through these epigenetic mechanisms how these stem cells develop. So there's multiple ways how they can really interact with us and use their genetic diversity in influencing human processes.
Hi. I'm wondering about the role of medications that are pretty much a part of everyday